Okay, today we're going to be learning Yoma Daf Kaf Gimel. I'm excited to say that we have reached 1.2 million downloads of the Shiur since the Siyum, which is very exciting. It shows the tremendous growth of Talmud Torah, particularly among women, also men, learning from women. It's an amazing accomplishment, and thanks to all of our amazing listeners. There's a good Facebook post about it. Share it around and spread that love of Torah and try to inspire others. So we can get to even higher numbers and spread Torah all around. This week's shiurim are dedicated by Shira and Bill Futornik for the Refuah Shlema of Michelle Futornik, Alana Bat Miriam, the Refuah Shlema are learning for her, and by Aviva Adler on her father, Dr. Joseph Kahana's 5th year at site. We learn Nishmat Yosef ben Tzvi HaKohen Zichrono Livracha. Okay, we're going to start our daf with where we were yesterday. We ended with this issue that only right after class I said, wait, there's something that I forgot to mention, which is very important. In the daf, we basically said that we have, one second. Okay. So in the daf, we saw yesterday that Shaul HaMelech, on the one hand, it said that you have to have this kupashal shratzim tluyalo me'achorav. So you basically have to have something, some bad something, right? You can't be too arrogant. On the other hand, that doesn't exactly work together with the last statement we said, which was that Shaul HaMelech was punished because machal al kvodo. Now, generally, you would say that someone who's mochel al his kavod is someone who basically says, okay, I'm not so important. It's okay. So you're trying to humiliate me, I'll let it go. Now, that doesn't really go hand in hand. And that's, I think, what the challenge is here, to find that balance between, on the one hand, not being super arrogant and thinking I'm king of the world. And on the other hand, but being able to basically say that, if someone goes up against me, I have to put my foot down. And that it's partly also understanding, and maybe it really works hand in hand if you realize it's not all about you. It's all about you. So you could say, I don't really care, but it's not all about you. It's about that you're representing a nation and you're representing God. And therefore you don't have the control to just say, if someone does something, I don't really care, because it has ramifications for many other people. And maybe that really does go with not being arrogant and humility. But there's this fine line between humility and yet saying, you have to treat me with respect. And you see what happened because, and if you look in the Psukim, this Pasuk appears, this Bnei Bilial, who basically, embarrassed him after the whole coronation, and then said, it says, Vayikam acharish, he was silent. The next pasuk is, Vayal nachash hamoni, and he realizes, oh, this king, I can, and look, it had huge ramifications on the nation. So that's what you have to realize. It's not about you. It's that you're a representative of the nation. It's hard not to think about, the fact that we're struggling to get a government going here and about important characteristics of what a good leader, what we're looking for in a good leader. Okay. So at the very end of Kaf Bet, there's clearly this reference to the Nachash we just mentioned, Nachash Amoni. Obviously, he wasn't a snake, but now we're talking about it as a snake. But anyone who doesn't take revenge like a snake, Eino Talmid Chacham. If you're a rabbi or a Torah scholar, is a better translation, and you don't take revenge like a snake, you're not a Talmid Chacham, okay? Which basically is a connection to the last statement we just said. How you can't just let people walk all over you because you're representing Torah. It makes a lot of sense. The problem is, look at the language they use. Nikima, nitira, we know that from the Torah. B'aktiv, but it says in the Torah, lo tikom v'lo titol. You're not allowed to take revenge. So how could you possibly say this? So the answer, hahu b'mamon hu dichtiv. Oh, don't worry. Talmid Chacham that's when you attack him and what he represents, the Torah. But if you take someone's money and you do something to someone's money, then they're not allowed to exact revenge against you. How do we know it's talking about money? There, Tanya. There's a very famous line. What's the difference? I specifically kind of translated it just as revenge. It's hard to translate it unless you read the source, which is what's the difference between the two types of revenge that are mentioned in the verse. And this is famous because Rashi quotes it there, and anyone who learns this in school, they always learn this. What's the difference? Nikima is Amarlo Hashileni Magalcha. Amarlo Lav. Say, please lend me your what's it called? The sith. Please lend me your sith. And I think that's what it's called. And he says, lav, no. Lemachal, amar lahu hashileni kadromcha. A sickle, that's the word. Thank you. I knew I was saying the wrong word. The sickle. So lend me your sickle, and he says no. And then the next day, the other person says, lend me your spade. And now he wouldn't lend you the sickle yesterday. So now you're not lending him, or your axe. You're not lending him your axe. Amar lo, eini mashicha kederech shelo ishiltani. I'm not going to loan you the way you wouldn't loan me. That's revenge. Zohi nekama. Ve'ezohi nitira. How do we define nitira, the other term? Amar lo hashileni kadromcha. Says, lend me your axe. Amar lo. Says, no, sorry, I won't. Lemachar amar lo hashileni chalukcha. The next day he says, lend me your cloak. I wonder if they specifically chose, in the first case, there were things that were somewhat similar to each other. Here they're somewhat different. Right? One is clothing and one is a tool. And he says, amar lo helach. Here, take it. Eini kamotcha shelo ishiltani. Look, I'm not going to be like you. You wouldn't lend me something yesterday, but I'll lend you my clothes. Okay, that's nitira. Okay, zohi nitira. Now, if you just give it to him, that's fine. But if you give it and you say, I'm doing this because, I'm not going to be like you, that's what we call nitira. Now, both are ways of mentioning what he did to you and how that's impacting your actions. So now we have this explanation, very simple explanation. Okay, when it comes to a Talmid Chacham, and we're not talking about that they took your money, but they were trying to do something against respecting you, so that we understand you have to take revenge. When it comes to your money, you don't. You're not allowed to. To which the Gemara asks, "V'tzara degufa lo." Wait a minute. You can't. Tzara deguf. If someone's causing pain to your body, you're not allowed to take revenge. Okay, whether it's physical pain or verbal or emotional pain, you're not allowed to. You're not obligated in nikimav netiran, meaning it's not forbidden for you to take revenge. Right now, until now, we said if someone tries to disrespect you, insult you, right? This we all know is very common nowadays, right? People will put out an article in the paper against you and try to slander you. So first we said, if you're a Talmid Chacham, you have to. Not only are you allowed to, but you have to. Now the Gemara says, really? Are you sure? We're going to show you a source where it's clear that you're not supposed to take revenge if someone does that. How so? So the source says, Ha-Tanya, and we saw this in Masachet Shabbat, Ha-ne'elavim ve'enam olvim, shom'im charpatam ve'enam meshivim. Those who are insulted by someone, but do not insult back. Those who hear someone slander them and they don't respond, right? They always say that's the best response. If someone tries to slander you, just ignore it, right? The more you respond, the more you make a big deal of it. They do it out of love and they don't mind all the suffering that comes their way. Okay, this is praised by God. It says about them, this verse, and those who love him, it will be like the sun coming out in its glory. What does that have to do with anything? The sun coming out in its glory. So this is a reference to a famous midrash about the sun and the moon, that they were both the same size. And then the moon started to complain, we can't have two leaders. Again, we're going back to this topic of leadership and how to have leaders. We can't have two leaders who are the same size. We'll fight, we'll have jealousy between us. To which God said, fine, you're complaining, I'll make you smaller, right? And the sun ends up being the greater one because the sun was silent. Silence is a much better response to these kind of things. So those who are silent will get rewarded, basically, like the sun. So what do you see here? The Talmid Chacham is not supposed to go take revenge. So what's going on here? So they answer a very strange answer, and we'll try to understand it. La'olam dinakit le b'libeh. The Talmid Chacham, if someone does something that's how would you say, against God, so to speak, and against the Torah that he represents, so he shouldn't go out. If someone tries to slander this Talmid Chacham, which then becomes, we all know that when anyone gets slandered, who's a rabbi or some public figure in the Jewish world, it just reflects badly on God and the Jewish people, etc. If they do that, you shouldn't respond out loud. You should keep it in your heart. Okay, you shouldn't forget about it. And what does that do? Okay, so, and that when it said, anyone who's no kem v'notel kenachash is not a Talmid Chacham, basically what they're saying is you have to hold it in your heart, not say anything out loud, hold it in your heart. What is holding it in your heart to? So the Mepharshim explain, and this is what's a little hard to understand. If you hold it in your heart, what will happen? Well, somehow it will get back to this person, and it's not directly, but somehow someone else will do the work for you. In other words, it's not in his dignity and he shouldn't be responding, but somehow, in some way, by you holding it in, it will somehow affect that this person will eventually get punished for what they did. So that's very hard to understand what the connection is. But I thought of a possible connection, which is that if I bear a grudge against someone, everybody knows that you can't hide your feelings, really. So when I'm talking to that person, or if I have something or that person's name comes up in conversation, if I'm bearing this grudge inside me about this person, people will see that. So the idea here is I shouldn't say it out loud, because it's demeaning for me almost, right? And you shouldn't do that. But if I bear it in my heart, then people will eventually get the sense that something's up with this person, and eventually he'll end up getting punished for what he said. So maybe that's a possible way of understanding how this can work in a right, unless we just say it just happens in a metaphysical way, that God somehow orchestrates it because I bear the grudge, right? That's a little harder for me to understand anyway. But if I bring it down to earth, I think that there is some kind of way, in a real way, that could affect things. So now we've made our distinctions. We have mammon, you can't do nikima v'netira at all. You have to move beyond it. When it comes to your body, well, if you're Talmid Chacham and you're representing Torah, then you have to keep it in your heart, but you can't bring it outside. Okay, that you can't start, and that's what we learned from the Olvim ve'enam hane'elavim ve'enam olvim. Now we say, but wait, anyone who doesn't bear a grudge and moves beyond things, God removes all their sins. So how could you say that bearing your grudge is a good thing? Bearing a grudge doesn't sound like it's a good thing. To which the Gemara answers, and now we're going to make one further distinction. First of all, it's interesting. They're using the lashon of payis that we've been talking about, this idea of the payis and the lottery. So mefayis means, though, if the person went and asked for forgiveness, then you're not allowed to bear a grudge. Then God, if you get beyond that, if they come and ask for forgiveness and you let them you're appeased, then you can move on. And if you do that, God will remove all your sins. But if they don't come and apologize, then you should bear the grudge in your heart, not say it out loud. And hopefully, eventually, that will cause the person to get his punishment that he deserves. Okay, so that's how we resolve this whole sugya. Now we're moving back to our Mishnah. Right? They put out one or two fingers, right? Which this reminds me of this game we used to play. Actually, I realize it's not Yini, Mini, Mani, Mo. It's the third finger is it or something, right? I forget what the game was called, but we used to, right? You used to put out fingers. You put out either one or two fingers, and they would count fingers. I'm trying to remember because it was a long time ago, but you would put out either one or two fingers. Now, I don't know why you always didn't put out two fingers, because it always increases your chances of getting chosen if you have more fingers out, which is exactly the base of the basis of this sugya, which is how could you put out two fingers? And if you could put out two fingers, then why would you ever put out one? Right? I don't know why we never put out always two fingers. So it could be that we put out two fingers or one finger just because we didn't really understand the game well enough. We were too young to realize that putting out two fingers will increase our chances. I'm not really sure. Anyone who has some insight to that game, you can let me know. But here the Gemara is going to say, if you're allowed to put out two fingers, then why are they even asking about one? In other words, why would they even say one? Obviously, everyone's going to put out two fingers because you're going to increase your chances of getting chosen. Remember what happens. And first of all, this was described in the Mishnah as a case if there was a tie. But the issue is that it's not just if it's a tie in the times when they used to do it by racing, but this was how they did the pies. This is how the lottery was done. So they would pick some high number, all the kohanim would put their fingers in, and they would count kohanim. And this was just a way, as we saw yesterday, of counting, right? This wasn't a way of figuring out, right? It was just a way of counting heads. So you certainly don't want to be counted twice. That would be unfair. So let's see what they say. We're talking about someone who's healthy, does one finger. Someone who's not healthy, what does it mean not healthy? Well, it means can't control his fingers perfectly. So it's hard for him to put out one finger without putting out two. So if that's the case, right, sometimes it's hard for people to separate their fingers perfectly. So if he can't do that, then he's allowed to put two fingers out. Okay, now, Hatanya, and here we're going to bring a braita that proves this. Okay, Hatanya is often a question. In this case, it's actually a proof. Okay, and we see in a braita, Echat motziin, shtayim ein motziin. You put out one, you don't put out two fingers. But in which case is this referring to? Exactly as we said, bibari, in a healthy person. If the person's sick, they can even put out two. Not only sick people, but also individuals. What does it mean, individuals? So we imagined, at least I imagined, that we bring all the Kohanim together, let's say in a circle or in a line, and they all stand up, and the Kohen calls out a number, and he starts going and counting all the people. But it seems like it could have been done where people were sitting in different places, and maybe the Kohen walked around from one to the other. So if you're sitting all by yourself, you could put out two fingers because there's no way. Right? If he just sees a whole bunch of fingers, I'm thinking of those pictures. My kids like to do them, where everybody sticks their fingers in the middle and you take the picture from the top and you just see fingers, right? That's kind of the vision that the Kohen has when he's doing this. All he sees is fingers. He doesn't see faces. And that's why they could basically make a mistake. But if people are sitting in different places in the room, then you're certainly not going to count somebody twice. So then they could put out more than two fingers. So that's another case why. Okay. There's questions that you have to ask about cholim. And I see, Becky, you asked the question about how could they do birkat kohanim if they can't separate their fingers. It's a good question. And maybe they're balei mumim, and how could we be letting them do this? Wait with that, because we're going to get back to later that a baal mum maybe could actually do this activity. Maybe this is something a baal mum is allowed to do. So we'll get back to that later. So now they say, so Yechidim motzim shtayim, we're still in this brayta, ve'ein monim lahem ela echat. But we only count them as one, even if they put out two fingers. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute, ein monim lo ela echat? Really? You only count them as one? But wait, in this brayta, it seems to indicate, although we'll see now really, but they think at first glance that this brayta indicates if you put out two fingers, we count you as two. V'hatanya, it says in a brayta, ein motziim lo shalish, you don't put out your middle finger, v'lo gudal, and not your thumb, mipnei haramaim, because we're worried you're going to try to cheat, right? You might put out two fingers and you'll cheat. Now, we talked about it yesterday. The thumb and the pinky are far away, or even your second finger could be far from your first finger, your index finger. So theoretically, you could put out both and trick someone. But your second and your third finger, it's harder to trick. You could separate them, but they kind of makes it, it's pretty clear that it's from the same hand. But still, they say don't put it out anyway, because it'll look like you're trying to cheat. But then it says, even though you're not allowed to, if you did, monim lo, it's counted anyway. Now, what the assumption is, they assume it means it's counted, meaning they count your index finger and they count your middle finger. And that seems to contradict what we just said. But before we get there, they say, gudal, if you put out your thumb, though, ein monim lo, and not only do they not count you, you're disqualified from the game, so to speak. You're out of the lottery. You can't have a chance. Not only that, but you get lashes from the one who's in charge of the lashes. We'll get to this word pakia in a minute, what exactly it means. So my monim lo, so now they say, oh, don't worry. It doesn't mean that if you put out your third finger, they're going to count your index finger and your middle finger. My monim lo nami achat. No, it means you can be counted. You don't get disqualified. Okay, because you probably weren't really trying to trick anyone, because you can't really trick anyone in that way. And therefore, you're not supposed to, but if you did it, we let you stay in the count, but obviously you only get counted once. You're certainly not going to get counted twice. My pakia, now they just want to know, we're in a little section of etymology. The Gemara says, what's the word pakia? Where does it come from? Amarav, madra. It means madra. Okay, that's not so helpful, not only to us, but also to them. My madra. So in a later generation, they said, what is madra that Rav mentioned? Amarav papa, matrika detaye de psikreshen. We're talking about a whip of one of these Arab merchants that where you split the top, you shredded it a little bit. And then that's the whip that he used to whip people. Do you remember all this? We saw this in Shkalim. Ben Bava is in charge of the Pekia. So he said in the beginning, I thought, that when it says in the Mishnah, Ben Bava Mimuneh ala Pekia, Amina Ptilata. I would have said the Ptil. Okay, that it's talking about the wicks. Remember we saw this, that he's in charge. They weren't sure what this meant. Is he in charge of the wicks in the temple, the wicks for the menorah? Kiditnan, as it says. Now, why would they have connected pakia with wicks? That's not the word for wicks. From the clothes that had already started wearing away, were no longer usable of the kohanim, they would, and from their belts, they would be mafkia, which means they would shred them. From that, they would make the wicks. And from that, they would light the candles in the menorah. So I thought that Pekia comes from mafki'in in this source, and that it meant he was in charge of the wicks, which would make sense because we're talking about all these temple-related issues. He was the one in charge of the wicks. Kevan de Shaman, and he probably made the wicks, right, from the clothing. Kevan de Shaman ala haditanya below ela shalokem imanemuneh bepakia. But then I saw this source, and it says you get lashes from the person in charge of the pakia. Now that can't be you get lashes of the person in charge of the wicks. Certainly, wicks are not something that you'd be able to give lashes to anyone with. So Amina my pakia nagda. So I realized pakia must be the whips, and it was the person in charge of punishing people in the temple. Okay, now we get to our big story. Okay, we saw yesterday, I want to repeat the details because I want you to notice the difference in the details. Yesterday, we saw the story was that there were shnehem ratzim, they were both running, they were both shavim veratzim, they started at the same point, they started running. Right, I compared it to a car race, you're racing and one knocks the other one off the way, right? Or a biking race or something like that, you can imagine. And he falls off the ramp and he breaks his leg. Now, whether he intended to make him fall off the ramp or not, right, is a good question, not so clear. But, that's the story. So now, right, it doesn't look like he had terrible evil intent. He just really wanted to get him off the ramp, right? Or get him not necessarily off the ramp, but slow him down. So now we're going to see a different version of this story. Now, the Gemara is going to view this as if there are two different stories that happen at two different times, which is possible. It's also possible it's a different version of the same story. Tanu Rabbanit. Starts out exact same way. They were both equal. They were running up the ramp. One of them gets within 4 amot of his friend. That sounds weird. It doesn't really mean that. According to most of the Mefarshim, what it means is one of them went up ahead. Okay, kidem. He went up ahead and he got to the finish line. When it means 4 amot of chavero, it means he got, even though it's not what it sounds like, but he got past the finish line, basically. Now, at this point, this is different. The other story, they were both going up the ramp and nobody had won yet, and he wanted to increase his chances of winning. At this point, the other person won. Now, if he won, well, he's stuck, right? He's not going to get the job no matter what. So he's feeling a little more helpless than the person yesterday who could basically just push the guy out of the way and run forward. So what happened? Natal Sakin, he grabs a knife. And there's hazards of the job, right? You're in a place where there's a lot of slaughtering knives because you're in the temple, right? You might say, what's he doing with a knife? But they slaughter people right? They slaughter animals all the time. So now, Natal, Freudian slip there. Natal Sakin, he took out a knife, Vitakalo bilibo, and he stabs the person who won the lottery. This already is much more extreme, right? We have murder here in the middle of the temple. You can imagine what a horror. Well, the story gets worse, if you can imagine. First of all, you can already imagine, right? Well, let's read and then we'll talk about it. Amar Rabbi Tzadok amalot ha'ulam. So Rabbi Tzadok gets up on the stairs of the ulam. Remember, there's these stairs going up to the ulam. I already mentioned the Shuli Mishkan talks about Rabbi Tzadok on today's flashback article, and Shiur and Chamutal discuss this idea of death in the temple, and also actually talk about levayat hachai, like being the laves, someone who's alive and dead. Anyway, that's their topic for Daf Shalahem from today's story. So Rabbi Tzadok gets up and starts going up the steps to the ulam. V'amar achenu beit Yisrael shma'o. He says, listen up, my brethren, my Jewish brethren. Harei hu omer. It says in the Torah, ki yimatzeh halal ba'adama v'yatzuz kenechu shoftecha. Who starts to quote the verses of Egla Arufa, which is funny because we just mentioned it yesterday. Remember, Shaul HaMelech comes and says, we shouldn't kill Agag, right? He uses Egla Arufa as a way of bringing rachamim, right? This is after murder. He says, what happens in Egla Arufa? Someone's killed. We don't know who's responsible. And we have to blame, right? We have to measure from the 2 closest cities. So he says like this, Anu amilavi Egla Arufa. Who's responsible for this action? Who's supposed to bring the Egla Arufa? Al ha'il or al ha'azarot? This is a fascinating line. Is it the city of Jerusalem? Or is it the Azarot, the temple? Right, which really, in my mind, is saying, is it the Kohanim who are responsible for this? Or is it the Jewish people? Whose responsibility is this? How did we let such a thing happen? We're going to have some questions about this because the Gemara is going to say, what are you talking about, Egla Arufa? We know who's responsible. Why are you blaming the city or the Kohanim? It's the person who killed, right? Egla Arufa is, well, we don't know who the murderer is. We know exactly who the murderer is. So we're going to get back to that. Ga'u kol ha'am bebechiyah. Everybody starts to cry. Okay, everybody's upset. Right? Basically, this is what you call, right? A big charismatic speaker gets up and he makes everybody cry and realize how serious this is. Ba'aviv shel tinok. You notice, by the way, he doesn't get an answer to his question. Right? It was probably more a rhetorical question, and we'll talk about it soon. Ba'aviv shel tinok u'mitzaok shu mefarper. Well, the story continues. It's very interesting the way they say this. The father of the child, they even call it a baby, but it really means a child often, a tinok. Not in modern Hebrew, tinok is a baby. In the Gemara, it's often a child. The father of this child came. So the father comes now. He's the father of this child who killed someone, who's dying, the one who's about to die. Right? We thought he was dead, but it turns out he's not yet dead. And they see he's flailing. He's not yet dead. So the father says, he should atone for your sins, right? Meaning that's really the answer to the question, right? He will be the atonement for the sins of the people. Right? This, by the way, this kapara, hard to understand, but right, people often say the death of tzaddikim atones for people. His death should atone. But then he says, look, my son hasn't died yet. He's still flailing. Velonit ma'as sakin. And the sakin is not yet impure. The knife hasn't become impure because if it's in a dead body, it will become impure. But it's not yet impure because my son hasn't died. Which basically he's saying, get the knife out of him right now so that we save the knife from becoming impure. Now, I want you to imagine that you're the father, right? This terrible tragedy happens in the temple. Your son's trying to do the right thing. He dies right there, right? Hard to not conjure up images from what happened recently. Your first reaction is not going to be, oh, let's make sure that the knife doesn't become tameh, right? That's not the first thing that you're thinking about at that moment. Lilamdecha, so the Braita finishes by saying, this is to teach you, they were more concerned with their impurity of the purity and impurity of their vessels than they were about death. Okay, they had skewed priorities. And we'll prove it more. And interesting, they're going to use a quote from by Rishon, the first temple, to prove about the second temple. But Menashe spilled blood indiscriminately until it was filled. The city of Jerusalem was filled with blood. So you see here, Shfichut Damim was not they didn't really care so much about death. Okay, quite hard to understand. I want to read you a section from Josephus where he talks about, right, in the War of the Jews. He says here, I'll read you the section in English, and now all the rest of the commanders of the Romans deemed this sedition among their enemies to be of great advantage to them. There was all this inner turmoil among the Jewish people, right? This is the same time period. And were very earnest to march to the city. They all wanted to go and attack the Jewish people. And they urged Vespasian, as their lord and general in all cases, to make haste, and said to him that the providence of God is on our side by setting our enemies at variance against one another. That still the change in such cases may be sudden, and the Jews may quickly be at one again, either because they may be tired out with their civil miseries or repent of such doings. But Vespasian replied that they were greatly mistaken in what they thought fit to be done. Here's the big, right? They're standing. The Romans are about to attack the Jewish people, and their leader says to them, don't go attacking. He says, as those that upon the theater love to make a show of their hands and of their weapons, but do it at their own hazard without considering what was for their advantage and for their security. For that if they now go and attack the city immediately, they shall but occasion their enemies to unite together and shall convert their force. Now it is in its height against themselves. But if they stay a while, they shall have fewer enemies because they will be consumed in this sedition that God acts as a general of the Romans better than he can do, and is giving the Jews up to them without any pains of their own and granting their army a victory without any danger. That, therefore, is their best way, while their enemies are destroying each other with their own hands and falling onto et cetera, et cetera. You get the point. The point is, let the Jews kill themselves because there's so much inner turmoil. If you start fighting against them, they'll all unite. We're better that they're fighting against each other. They're doing our work for us, and we don't even have to go in and fight war. So that's a reflection of what was going on in that time, and that's what you see from this Gemara as well. Okay, so they have their priorities off, right? It's all about they want to get to the top. They want to be the one doing the work. Of course, once he kills someone, he can't do work in the temple, but he probably wasn't thinking about that, right? Anyone who murders someone is not allowed to do work in the temple. So now the Gemara asks, hey ma'aseh kadim. Now which happened first? Okay, so now we're going to have a bit of an issue here. So we'll get back to the Kohanim. So we'll talk about the Kohanim in a bit when we get back to analyzing this story. So now, hey ma'aseh kadim, which one happened first, the murder or the broken leg? Now we're going to see, it doesn't make sense either way. That's why I said it's possible. They're just two versions of the same story. But the Gemara understands they must be two different stories. If we think the murder happened first, it doesn't make sense. After a murder, they wouldn't have, this goes back to what we talked about yesterday, about learning your lesson. If we didn't learn our lesson yesterday, right, if we didn't learn our lesson from a murder, then they're going to learn their lesson and change things from a broken leg. And if you say it was a broken leg first, well, what did we learn? After the broken leg, they instituted the lottery system. So what do they need these 4 amo for? In other words, there wouldn't be this race. The whole race was only because they hadn't instituted the pies. And we know they instituted the pies after the broken leg. So it can't possibly be that this would have even happened. So therefore, it must be the murder happened first. Why? Now, this is really important in terms of what we saw yesterday. When it first happened, that murder, they said, oh, this is a one-off. That's a crazy guy, right? That's not going to happen again. We don't need to change a system because of some crazy person, right? That's not going to happen again. This is unfortunate that they didn't learn their lesson. And then, once they saw that, okay, fine, maybe we're not going to have murder in the temple every day, but you might have someone breaking a leg. They said, okay, you know what? This happened twice already, some sort of catastrophe, one less than the other, less severe, but still saw that it was dangerous. They said, let's institute the pious, the lottery. Okay, so that's also another interesting in terms of thinking about, act before it's too late, right? Don't think, oh, this just is a one-off, but take precautions always to make sure that things don't happen. Amad Rabbi Tzadok, now we're just going to quote parts of this Braita and analyze them. So Rabbi Tzadok gets up on Ma'alot HaUlam and he says, Achenu be'Yisrael, Shim'u harei Omer, ki matzeh chalab adama, ami alahavi, ala iro, ala azavo. So the first question they ask is, Yerushalayim bat atuya egla arufahi? They take this very literally and they say, Jerusalem can't be in Egla Rufa city. It's just not possible. Because Hatanya, it says in the Braita, there's 10 unique things said about Jerusalem. And one of them is, they don't bring Egla Rufa in Jerusalem. And furthermore, as I said before, it says that we don't know who killed in the Egla Rufa. Psukim. And in this case, we know exactly who killed. He just said it for effect. He wanted to get everybody crying, which he succeeded in doing. He wanted to wake everybody up. Now, you could say that it was for effect, but I think it's more than that. I think what he was trying to say is, it's true that we know who's responsible, but this person is a product of us. We created a situation where this could happen. We created a situation where a person like this could get up in the temple and kill someone, which, I imagine when they built the temple, no one ever thought that would ever happen. There would be murder in the temple. Certainly not in this kind of, out of a wanting to do a ritual in the temple, we're going to kill somebody. That's crazy. What they're saying is someone's responsible for this. And then it goes back to what Bill, you were saying about the Kohanim. It goes back to, is it a problem in the kahuna? Is it the Kohanim, the Azarot, the temple and the way the temple functions? Is it a temple problem? Or is it a societal problem? Is it something in the outside, in Jerusalem, in the city? Is it everybody responsible, right? This goes back to also, when you say who's responsible, it's true. You could say the person who, did this or did that, but in the end, it goes all the way back. This is a product of our society. And that's something that, is very important to think about. And obviously a lot of thoughts from this Gemara can be, you can take this in terms of events that recently happened. So again, he makes this, right? The Braita makes this statement. Clearly, they care more about purity laws than they did about death. So now there's a classic Gemara question. When you're saying that one is more than the other, the question is, what's the norm and what's out of the realm of norm? Okay, well, you'll see our question in a minute. Let's say you have there's normally people care about death at this midpoint? Is it that they didn't really care about shvichut damim at all, and they went this way on the scale of shvichut damim? But tarat kelim kedekaima kaima. In other words, let's assume we have a scale, and on the scale we first get to purity, and then we care more about killing people. But killing people moved all the way down, and purity was in the same place. O Dilma, or is it the reverse? Shvichut damim kedekaima kaima. They did care about shvichut damim. It wasn't that they didn't care; they cared in a normal way. But tarat kelim udechamir, they were extreme. Right? The question is, what were they more extreme about? Were they extreme that they really didn't care about death? Or were they extreme that they cared so much in a crazy way about laws of purity? So, Tashma, midkanasiv la Talmud, v'gam nakish, dam nakish, hafach menashe, shma minash, shvichut damim udezal, v'tarat kelim kedekaima kaima. Even though we've talked a lot about the Tzdukim and how much they were so into purity, in the end, the Gemara says, from that source, it seems clear, since they quote the verse in Menashe, that people were dying all over the place. They just didn't care about people being killed. Then, right, you can think about places in the world. They just have no regard for human life. So that's, or times in history where there were people who did that. So basically, if you have no regard for human life, that was the issue, because that's exactly what it says in the Braita. And it's tarat kelim was normal, wherever it normally is. It's just that shvichut damim went way low on the scale. Okay, now we're moving to a different topic. It's still on the Trumat HaDeshen, and this action of, remember, there's two actions. There's first, you take a little bit off and you put it in this pile next to the altar. And then when the pile gets really big, you move them out. And that's called Hotza'at HaDeshen. There's Haramat, which is to take it off the altar and put it down on the floor on the east side of the ramp on the floor. And then there's removing it entirely from the temple. So in the verses in the Torah, you can see on the sheet, it says, Vayikra chapter 6, verses 3 and 4. We've seen this verse before, and we're going to have some repeat in this sugya. The Kohen wears his cloak and his pants he wears. Again, the word wears appears twice. We're going to darshan that the same way we darshaned it last time. He wears on his body. And then, so while he's wearing these clothes, he picks up the deshen. Notice only two clothing of the Kohen Gadol are mentioned here and not the other two. Okay, the mitznefet, the hat, and the avnet. The turban and the avnet, which is the belt, aren't mentioned. And then you pick up from the altar, you do the haramat hadeshen. Then he takes off those clothes. He puts on other clothes. It sounds very much like the Kohen Gadol who's switching his clothes. Here we're talking about a regular Kohen on a regular day. And then he takes the deshen outside. So now the Gemara is going to say, Tanu Rabbanit, as I said, it sounds like Yom Kippur. At the end of Yom Kippur, he takes off his clothes and then he puts on regular clothes, or maybe he goes down in level, right? He has the 8 and the 4, and he switches from 8 to 4, right? You go down. But Talmud Lamar, so you might have thought maybe he puts on regular clothes to take out the deshen. Now the Kohen Gadol has 8 clothes and 4 clothes, right? He has 2 different sets for Yom Kippur. And we talked about that. He changes between them. But a regular Kohen only has 1 set. So if he's going to change his clothes, what's he changing into? Must be big day chol, regular clothes. To which the Braita says, Talmud Lama upashat begadav lavash begadim achirim. He takes off those. If he takes off his clothes, then you wouldn't say he puts on other clothes. Obviously, he puts on other clothes, doesn't walk around naked, right? So obviously, he puts on other clothes. The fact they say he puts on other clothes comes to teach you those clothes are like the others. Begadim shalovesh mekish begadim shalovesh begadim sheposhet. They must be of the same caliber. They have to be the 4 clothes of the Kohen. Im ken, so obviously then what's he changing into? Others. He must wear less like worn out ones that aren't in great shape, to take the deshen out of the temple entirely. We'll see in a minute why this is, and we actually saw this sugya once before in the Gemara already. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, achirim vehotzi. He darshans this differently. He says, notice it says, v'lavash v'adim achirim vehotzi et hadeshen. He connects those 2 words, other and taking out. And he darshans something entirely different, not from the pshat. Limein ala kohanim ba'alei muim sheksharim lotzi hadeshen. If you have a balmun, he actually can take the ashes out of the temple. That's a job he can do, because we're going to see, according to him, it's not really avodah. Okay, rituals have to be done by the Kohen. This isn't a ritual, so the balmun can do it. Amar. So let's go into depth a little bit about these cases. As the Tan of Rabbi Yishmael said, okay, we learned this in Masechet Shabbat. The Tana de Rabbi Yishmael, remember this? You wear different clothes when you're in the kitchen, they get very dirty. Then the clothes, you're not going to walk out in those dirty stained clothes with oil stains, etc., when you go to serve before the king or before your master. So therefore, when you're going to take out this big pile, a little bit of ashes you can do without getting dirty. But when you're taking out a big pile of ashes, you're for sure going to get dirty. So wear older, right? Wear different clothing. Okay, so therefore we're going to wear clothes that are more worn out, like older Big Day Kohen Gadol rather than Kohen Hidyot, rather than new ones. Amar Rish Lakish. Now we're going to have a big machloket Rish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan. We're going to start with it today, continue with it tomorrow. They're machloket about whether a Baal Mum can do the avoda. Is also machloket. I told you we get back to this. Maybe he can also do it according to Rabbi Eliezer for the harama, for taking off the little bit of ashes and putting it next to the altar. Is that something that a Baal Mum can do or not? So there's a machloket about it by Hotza'at Hadeshen, and according to Rish Lakish, there's also machloket about it by Haramat Hadeshen. Kemachloket b'Hotza'ah, kach machloket b'Harama. Okay, they have the same machloket in both cases. Rabbi Yochanan says, Amar machloket b'Hotza'ah, aval b'Harama divrei hakol avodai. Everybody thinks Haramat Hadeshen is avoda. So now, right, that clearly, that's what we've been saying until now. It's an avoda. Now, we did say it happens at night, and maybe it's a little different, right? So the question is, it is a little different. How different is it? Is it not even avoda at all? In which case, a Baal Mum can do it or not? Again, only according to Rabbi Eliezer, a Baal Mum can do it. Tanakama doesn't think so. So, aval tama de Rish Lakish, my tama de Rish Lakish. Amar lacha. Now we're going to get it from the verses. He says like this: the reason it's not considered avoda is because for the following. It says he only wears 2 of the garments of the Kohen. You can't do avoda with 2 garments. You can only do rituals in the temple with 4 garments. So the fact that it says only 2 in the Torah means you only have to do it with 2 garments, which means it's not a ritual. And therefore, according to Rabbi Eliezer, a Baal Mum can do it. For Rabbi Yochanan says, no. It mentioned 2, but it meant all 4. Now, obviously, according to him, you have to say, why did it mention only 2? So midobad, which is a reference to the ketonet, it teaches you mido kemidato, had to be measured each kohen according to his size. Michnesebad l'chidetanya minayin. Why did it say this michnesebad? Because it wanted to teach you some other halach. Minayin shelo yehe davar kodem lemichnesayim. The special order in which he gets dressed. Okay, so think about this in your life. Do you always get dressed in the same way? Do you always put the first clothes on, certain clothes first? Do you have an order to it? Do you not? Right? Some people are very orderly about it. Some people not. This, obviously, there was significance to the order in which you get dressed. So he always had to put his pants on first of the 4 clothing of the Kohen Gadol. How do we know this? Because of a pasuk. It says, he has to put them on his basar. That means that's first, that goes on his flesh, and then he can add the other clothes. The Rish Lakish, so where is he going to learn these 2 halachas from? Since he thinks the 2 clothes are mentioned here for their own, to teach you only 2 and not 4. Mido, kemidato, mida afke rachmana b'lashon mido. It didn't have to say mido bad. Mido comes to teach you about the size. Shelo yeh davar kodem lemechnesayim me al b'saro nafka. Right? It still could have said michnese bad, right? Yilbash. But the fact that it says al b'saro, that's where you learn that halacha, not from the fact that michnasayim are mentioned. Now we're going to end with this nema kitanai. They're going to suggest that maybe the machloket between Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan about whether this is really avoda or it's not really avoda is based on a machloket tanaim actually. Al b'saro, matam ulomar yilbash. So it says al b'saro. Why does it say yilbash al b'saro? The beginning of the pasuk already said lavash, he wore. So why does it say he wore again? Lahavim mitznefef avnei laharamats, to teach you that yilbash, the extra yilbash, means you have to wear more things than just mentioned in this verse. What is that? The mitznefet and the avnei, meaning it's a real avoda. You have to wear all 4 clothing. That's Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. That clearly matches Rabbi Yochanan, who says it's all charted out on the sheet, right? Who says the machloket's only hotza'ah, haramat hadeshen is a real job. Rabbi Dosa Omer, l'rabot bigdeko, he learned something else. Now, it doesn't really matter what he learns. The point is he doesn't learn this because he holds like Rish Lakish, that it really means only 2. He learned something else from the word Yilbash. L'rabot bigdei kohen gadol, Yoma kippurim sheksherim lekohen gadol. Yilbash means someone else can wear them even after the kohen gadol finishes. Meaning, right, even though we're not talking about the kohen gadol here, but we're going to say the Kohen Gadol can wear some clothing that's not the normal clothing, which is the Kohen Gadol's clothing from Yom Kippurim. A regular Kohen can wear those too. So Amar Rebbe, we learned this already. Shtei Tshuvot b'davar, we learned this not so long ago. I have 2 problems with what you're saying. 1, They don't wear the same thing. Remember, we saw this. It's not the same belt. Their clothes are almost the same, other than the belt, according to one opinion, right? Rebbe's obviously of that opinion that it's not the same one. If you use it for high level sanctity, you can't then use for Yom Kippur, you can't now use it for low level sanctity. So what is the word yobash coming to do according to Rebbe? It's to teach you that you can wear worn out clothing, not torn clothing, but yes, worn out clothing for the Trumat Hadeshin. Okay, that's what it's teaching you. We'll stop here for today and gave you lots of food for thought for the day, and we'll pick up from here tomorrow.